In life-threatening disasters, the greatest danger often isn't panic, it's hesitation. The human brain frequently refuses to accept danger until precious seconds have already passed.
Right.
Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
Glad to be here for this one.
Yeah, it's a big topic today. Our mission for this deep dive is to explore a book called The Unthinkable.
Who survives when disaster strikes and why?
Exactly. By Amanda Ripley. We're using her research as an entry point into the psychological survival system that governs human behavior during emergencies.
And it really forces us to confront some pretty uncomfortable truths about human nature.
It really does. I mean, when we imagine a disaster like a fire or an earthquake or a sinking ship, we're heavily conditioned by popular culture.
Oh, absolutely. Hollywood blockbusters, novels, the way the nightly news frames things.
Right. They always portray these events as moments of just immediate, explosive chaos.
The assumption is that everybody instantly recognizes the danger, completely loses all rational control, and just panics.
Like a stampede.
Yeah, a stampede of screaming people. And the myth is that this every man for himself brutality only stops when the professional rescuers arrive.
The police, the firefighters.
Right, to restore order. But Ripley's investigation into historical catastrophes reveals a very different pattern.
Most people do not panic.
No, they don't.
Yeah.
Instead, they hesitate.
They just freeze.
Well, their brains struggle to interpret the situation quickly enough to act. The cognitive system we are examining today is exactly the human response to extreme threat.
Because when disaster strikes, your perception has to rapidly shift from ordinary life into survival mode.
And the brain is simply not optimized for the immediate recognition of unprecedented danger.
Which, it makes sense when you look at how we live, right? Our everyday lives are built entirely on patterns, predictability.
You expect the floor to hold your weight.
You expect the train to stay on the tracks.
You expect the office building to remain standing. So when something completely unprecedented happens, the brain doesn't instantly pivot to survival mode.
It hits the wall.
It absolutely hits a wall.
To really understand how deeply ingrained this hesitation is, we need to look back at the historical context. Specifically, a morning that fundamentally changed how we study human behavior in crises.
December 6, 1917.
Right, in the harbor of Halifax, Nova Scotia.
It's one of the most remarkable and tragic events of the 20th century.
World War I was raging in Europe at the time.
And the Halifax harbor was a critical staging area. It was absolutely packed with ships, troops, weapons, everything.
And that morning, a French freighter called the Mont Blanc was slowly pulling out, heading for France.
And we have to be clear about what was on this ship. It was essentially a floating munition dump.
Loaded with, what, over 2,500 tons of explosives?
Yes, TNT, picric acid, and a highly flammable benzol, all stacked on the deck and in the hold.
And at the exact same time, in a very narrow channel of the harbor, a Norwegian ship called the Emo was coming in.
And due to a series of miscommunications and just basic navigation errors, the Emo accidentally rammed the bow of the Mont Blanc.
But the thing is, it wasn't a violent cinematic collision.
No, not at all.
It was slow. It was almost a mundane accident. The ships just sort of ground against each other at a very low speed.
The collision itself wasn't catastrophic. The Emo eventually reversed and literally just sailed on.
But the crew of the Mont Blanc knew exactly what was in their cargo hold.
Sparks from the collision had ignited the benzol barrels on the deck. They knew the fire was out of control, and they knew their ship was a ticking time bomb.
So they abandoned ship.
They did. They rowed furiously for the opposite shore, screaming warnings in French.
Which, tragically, almost no one on the Halifax side of the harbor understood.
Right, so you have this burning ghost ship drifting toward a bustling city.
And it drifts for 20 minutes.
20 minutes of a burning bomb floating toward the docks.
It eventually brushes up against a pier, setting it on fire. And this is where the behavior of the crowd becomes the real focal point of the story.
People didn't run away.
No. They actually gathered on the shore to watch.
Office workers went to their windows to get a better view.
Children stopped on their way to school just to watch the spectacle of the burning ship.
Because they had absolutely no cognitive framework to understand the level of danger they were in.
To them, a burning ship was just a curiosity.
A break in the daily routine. They lacked the information to perceive the actual threat.
And then the fire reached the TNT.
The resulting blast was the largest man-made explosion in recorded history prior to the invention of the atomic bomb.
The sheer physics of it are terrifying to even consider.
It instantly vaporized the water around the ship. It actually exposed the harbor floor for a moment.
The blast wave shattered windows 60 miles away.
A tsunami, triggered by the explosion, swamped the shoreline.
And to make the apocalyptic scene completely overwhelming, a massive blizzard hit the ruined city that very night.
Nearly 2,000 people died instantly, and thousands more were blinded or severely injured by flying glass because they had been standing at their windows watching the fire.
And right in the middle of this absolute devastation was a man who would go on to change the field of sociology.
An Anglican priest named Samuel Henry Prince.
He happened to be eating breakfast in a restaurant near the port when the explosion occurred.
He survived, and he immediately began turning his church into a triage station to help the wounded.
But Prince was unique.
Right.
While the city was in ruins and everyone was just trying to survive, he was paying incredibly close attention to the bizarre ways people were acting.
He was observing things that defied all the assumptions we hold about disaster behavior.
Like what?
Well, he saw people enduring crude, completely unanesthetized operations on the sidewalks without showing any obvious signs of physical pain.
Wow.
He saw a soldier working relentlessly all day to clear rubble, seemingly ignoring the fact that one of his own eyes had been knocked out.
That is just, the shock must have been immense.
He stood in makeshift hospitals and morgues and watched parents look directly at their own children and fail to recognize them.
And he also noted a detail about the relief efforts, right?
Right. Yes, a detail that fascinated him. The very first organized relief station on the morning of the explosion wasn't set up by the military or the police or the government.
It was set up by a touring troupe of actors who just happened to be in town.
Exactly. Those observations became the foundation of modern disaster sociology.
After he helped rebuild Halifax, Prince went to Columbia University.
He took all these notes, all these strange human reactions, and synthesized them into a groundbreaking 1920 thesis called Catastrophe and Social Change.
He essentially proved that we don't just run around like headless chickens when things go wrong.
Disaster behavior isn't random chaos. It actually follows a deeply structured, observable pattern.
I love that quote of his from the thesis.
Oh, the molten metal one.
Yes, life becomes like molten metal, old customs crumble, and instability rules.
It's wonderfully poetic. He recognized that a catastrophe strips away the fragile veneer of everyday society.
But what replaces it isn't madness.
No, it is a different kind of psychological system. The rules change, the biology changes, but it is still a system.
And understanding that system brings us to the core paradox of Ripley's book.
What she identifies as the perception gap.
The perception gap is such a crucial concept. It's this idea that society as a whole operates under a massive shared delusion regarding safety systems.
We imagine that when something goes wrong, the professionals, the firefighters, paramedics, police will intervene immediately.
We picture them bursting through the doors the exact moment the smoke appears.
But the reality is that professional responders are almost never there in the earliest, most critical moments of a catastrophe.
It's the ordinary people who just happen to be standing nearby who perform the vast majority of rescues.
It forces a complete shift in perspective. The official systems are slow.
They have to receive the call,
Dispatch units, navigate traffic, assess the scene.
By the time they arrive, the most critical window for survival has usually closed.
The people who survive are the ones who act before the formal systems even know there is a problem.
So think about your commute tomorrow morning. You get on your train, or you walk into your office building, or you sit down in a coffee shop.
If an emergency happens in that exact moment, the paramedics aren't there.
The firefighters aren't coming for at least several minutes.
You are the first responder.
Your survival and the survival of the people right around you depends entirely on your own perception and your own actions long before the sirens start wailing.
Understanding how your brain works under extreme stress isn't just an academic exercise. It is the ultimate survival tool.
Exactly. And to understand how to use that tool, we have to trace the specific journey the brain takes during a crisis.
Ripley's research identifies a structural pattern that almost everyone experiences during emergencies. She calls it the survival arc.
It is a sequence of psychological stages, a journey from ordinary reality into the new reality of the disaster.
Almost no one survives without pushing or being pushed through three distinct phases.
Denial, deliberation, and the decisive moment.
Let's look at that first phase, denial.
Okay, let's unpack this. Faced with a sudden threat, whether it's an explosion, a fire alarm, or an aircraft emergency, the brain's immediate reaction is to attempt to interpret the event within familiar expectations.
Ripley paints this as the brain's lethal comfort blanket.
The story that really grounds this concept for me is about a woman named Elia Zedeno.
Yes, in the World Trade Center.
Right, on the morning of September 11, 2001, she was working at her desk in Tower 1.
It's a perfect illustration of how the brain actively resists new realities. Zedeno is at her desk when she hears the deafening crash of the plane hitting the building above her.
She actually feels the entire massive skyscraper sway back and
The
forth.
sensory evidence of a catastrophe is overwhelming. And yet, she doesn't immediately run for the stairwell.
She delays.
She starts looking for her purse. She walks in circles around her cubicle, almost as if she's in a trance.
And then, incredibly, she reaches out and picks up a mystery novel she had been reading.
From the outside, that sounds completely irrational. You feel a skyscraper sway, you hear an explosion, and you grab a paperback novel.
But if we look at the internal mechanics of what her brain was doing, it makes sense. This is the phenomenon known as normalcy bias.
Normalcy bias is an evolutionary feature, not a bug. The human brain evolved to preserve stability and avoid unnecessary alarm.
It operates as a highly efficient pattern-matching machine.
It constantly uses information from the past to understand the present and anticipate the future.
In almost every situation you will ever encounter, assuming normalcy is the correct and efficient choice.
If you are sitting in your office and a loud alarm goes off, assuming it is just a routine fire drill, saves you from the social embarrassment of sprinting out of the building in a panic over a burnt bagel in the break room.
You trust the pattern because the pattern has always been right before.
Precisely. But during rare catastrophic events, that exact same instinct becomes a massive liability.
The brain is so desperate to maintain the pattern of normal life that it will willfully ignore massive contradictory sensory evidence.
The alarms are dismissed as malfunctions. The smell of smoke is attributed to construction outside.
Zedeno's brain was desperately trying to interpret the catastrophic swaying of the building within her familiar expectations of a normal Tuesday morning at the office.
And what's terrifying is how common this is. She wasn't an outlier.
Not at all. Ripley points out that the average delay in the World Trade Center before people began to evacuate was 6 minutes.
6 minutes of sitting there
Uh-huh.
after a commercial airliner has impacted the building.
Some people waited up to 45 minutes.
They were calling their spouses to check in, calling their sisters in other states to see if they had seen anything on the news.
About 1,000 individuals actually took the time to properly shut down their computers before leaving their desks.
Their brains were so locked into the everyday script of leaving the office that they literally couldn't skip the steps.
It is a profound form of cognitive procrastination.
And it manifests in other bizarre ways beyond just continuing a routine. Sometimes it manifests as inappropriate emotion
Like laughter.
or total eerie silence. Ripley shares an anecdote in the book about a commercial flight that suffered a massive engine failure.
The one in St. John's, Newfoundland. This story is so dark, but it illustrates the point perfectly.
It really does. One of the plane's 4 engines had blown out. As the plane approaches the landing strip, the passengers look out the windows and see fire trucks and ambulances lining the tarmac.
Waiting for a potential crash.
The tension in the cabin is suffocating. The French flight attendant, whose English is deteriorating under the immense stress, stands up and starts yelling in this high-pitched, frantic voice, "Brace, brace."
And how do half the passengers react in this moment of exquisite, terrifying tension? They laugh.
They laugh. It completely shatters the Hollywood myth of everyone screaming and crying and praying.
They laugh because their brains literally could not process the reality of the impending crash.
The threat was so large and so entirely outside their normal daily pattern that the brain defaulted to a nervous, ironic dismissal of the danger.
But there's a very important nuance here.
Right. Ripley discovered, after speaking with countless survivors and trauma experts, that there is a duality to denial.
It's easy to look at it as a fatal flaw, a glitch in our programming that gets us killed.
But it can actually be life-saving.
It's a bizarre paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
The brain essentially lies to itself about the danger just so the body can survive long enough to escape the actual threat.
That is exactly what it is doing. Denial acts as a psychological shock absorber. It creates a temporary set of blinders for the conscious mind.
If Elia Zedeno had been forced to immediately reckon with the total horrifying reality of what was happening on 9/11 all at once.
The absolute certainty that a hijacked plane had impacted her building and she might burn to death or be crushed.
The overwhelming surge of pure terror might have paralyzed her completely.
She might have curled up under her desk in a fetal position and never moved.
So by focusing on the mundane, finding her purse, grabbing the mystery novel, her brain was pacing the intake of the trauma.
Yes, It allowed her to process only what her conscious mind could handle in that specific second.
It filtered the apocalypse down to a manageable task. Find the purse.
And once she did that, she could move to the next task, walk to the stairwell.
It protected her from the full weight of the terror, which eventually allowed her to make the long, tedious, terrifying trip down the stairs to safety.
Denial is a buffer, but it is a temporary one.
Right, because eventually the buffer breaks down. The normalcy bias can only hold off reality for so long.
The smoke gets too thick to ignore, the heat becomes unbearable, or someone grabs you by the arm and screams at you to move.
And that's when we transition to the second phase of the survival arc, deliberation.
Once the denial shatters, the brain accepts that the situation is abnormal and dangerous. It actively shifts to analyzing the environment to determine the appropriate response.
But again, this isn't a seamless instant transition to running for the exit.
During the deliberation phase, people realize something is terribly wrong, but they don't know what to do about it. So they look to others.
Sociologists have a term for this process: milling.
Milling, just standing around, gathering data.
No matter how loud and shrill the fire alarm is, no matter what an authoritative voice over a loudspeaker is telling them to do, humans feel a deep, compulsive need to verify the threat.
Studies consistently show that before deciding to act in an emergency, people will check with an average of 4 or more sources.
They will ask their coworkers what they think the noise was.
They will call a family member. They will check social media or the news.
They're frantically gathering data because their brain lacks the internal patterns required to make a confident decision.
And here's where it gets really interesting.
What happens inside the body?
Exactly. While you are standing there milling around, asking your deskmate if they think it's just a drill, your body is undergoing a massive, invisible physiological transformation.
The threat has finally been recognized by the subconscious, and the body is preparing for war.
The deliberation phase happens through the intense, distorting prism of fear. And fear fundamentally alters the chemistry and the mechanics of how our brains operate.
The body's first line of defense is hardwired deep in a primal structure called the amygdala.
Think of the amygdala as your brain's fire alarm. When it senses a threat, it triggers an ancient survival sequence. It immediately floods your system with cortisol and adrenaline.
But it's not just a one-time release. It creates a loop, doesn't it?
It creates a positive feedback loop, which is where things get dangerous. The fear triggers the stress hormones,
Those hormones circulate back to the amygdala and make it even more sensitive.
which triggers more fear, which releases more hormones. It's an escalating cycle.
Now, in a functioning system, another part of the brain called the hippocampus steps in.
Think of the hippocampus as the building manager who hears the fire alarm, looks at the smoke, and decides if it's a real fire or just a burnt piece of toast.
The hippocampus is involved in memory and regulating emotion. It is supposed to put the brakes on the amygdala.
But when the terror is too great, the building manager gets completely overwhelmed.
The fire alarm is so deafening that the building manager can't think.
The hippocampus fails to intervene, and the brain gets locked in. The amygdala just keeps firing away, hijacking the system.
When this happens, you lose access to your higher reasoning skills. The prefrontal cortex, where you do your logical thinking, goes dark.
You temporarily become a superhero in terms of physical potential. Your muscles are primed, your heart rate skyrockets, but you acquire severe cognitive learning disabilities.
You might lose fine motor skills.
Your vision might narrow to a literal tunnel.
And your perception of time can warp entirely. The time dilation aspect is fascinating.
The brain processes information so rapidly that time seems to slow down to a crawl.
Ripley includes an incredible story about the neuroscientist David Eagleman to illustrate this. When he was a child, maybe in the 3rd grade, he was exploring a house that was under construction.
He lost his footing and fell 12 feet off the roof.
It's a classic example of how the brain perceives a threat in freefall.
And he said the fall felt like it took forever.
He wasn't screaming in terror. He felt totally calm, as if he were floating through space and his brain was just rapidly cycling through options.
He considered reaching out and grabbing the edge of the roof, but he analyzed his trajectory and realized it was too late.
He watched the red bricks of the ground getting closer and closer. And in that stretched out moment of falling, his brain suddenly thought of Alice in Wonderland falling down the rabbit hole.
It wasn't until he actually landed face first on the ground that the fear finally hit him.
What's fascinating here is that bizarre thought about Alice in Wonderland. It is the key to understanding what happens during deliberation.
The brain is frantically searching its internal database for a script to address the unprecedented situation. It's trying to find a matching pattern to tell it what to do next.
But because Eagleman had never fallen off a roof before, he had no script for it.
So his brain grabbed the closest cultural reference it had, a children's story about falling down a hole.
There's another story in the sources that mirrors this perfectly, but with an adult. Diego Asensio.
The diplomat taken hostage.
Right, at a cocktail party. Suddenly, he finds himself crouched behind a couch during a furious, chaotic gunfight. Bullets are flying everywhere.
And he didn't have the cinematic experience of his life flashing before his eyes.
Instead, he started analyzing his own physiological reaction. He remembered reading Norman Mailer's famous World War II novel, The Naked and the Dead.
In that book, Mailer describes how soldiers under heavy fire would lose control of their bowels out of sheer terror.
Asensio is hiding behind this couch, checking his own bodily functions, and he realizes this isn't happening to him.
And in the middle of a literal shootout, his brain produces the deeply analytical thought, Mailer was wrong.
It highlights how desperately the brain relies on past information. It's grabbing for a war novel because it has no lived experience of a hostage shootout.
The brain needs a script to deliberate.
This naturally leads to a massive question. If we all share this basic neurological hardware, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the adrenaline, what makes some people better at this deliberation phase than others?
What makes someone able to think clearly while someone else gets completely locked in?
Yeah, exactly.
That is where the science gets incredibly nuanced and sometimes controversial. For a long time, researchers wondered if some people were just naturally, biologically wired to handle trauma better than others.
Ripley highlights a fascinating MRI study conducted on military veterans to look at PTSD.
The researchers looked at sets of identical twins. In each set, one twin had gone to combat in Vietnam and developed severe PTSD, while the other twin had stayed home and never experienced combat.
The researchers scanned their brains and found that the combat veteran with PTSD had a noticeably smaller hippocampus.
But wait, the initial assumption there would be that the horrific trauma of the war damaged the brain, right? That the stress shrank the hippocampus.
But if I remember the study correctly, the brother who stayed home safe and sound also had a smaller hippocampus.
Doesn't that completely blow up the idea that the trauma caused the brain shrinkage? Are you saying it's genetic?
That is exactly the friction this study introduced into the field.
Yeah.
The critical finding was that the smaller hippocampus wasn't solely the result of the trauma, it predated the trauma.
It suggests that certain biological profiles, determined largely by genetics, naturally put individuals at a higher risk for having a harder time processing fear and recovering from trauma.
If you are born with a smaller hippocampus, your building manager might not be as effective at putting the brakes on the amygdala's fire alarm.
It's not a moral failing or a lack of courage. It is literally the topography of the brain.
That feels a bit deterministic, though.
It does. But Ripley is careful to note that biology isn't destiny. A smaller hippocampus might actually have evolutionary advantages in other contexts.
Like what?
It might make someone hypervigilant, more attuned to subtle threats, and therefore less prone to wasting precious time in the denial phase.
It's just one factor in a sprawling equation of human behavior. And we also have to remember that biology isn't just about the brain.
Right. Physical reality plays a massive role.
The sources point out that heavier individuals, for example, face statistically lower survival chances in dynamic disasters, like car crashes, plane evacuations, or escaping a burning building.
This isn't just about the speed of running. It involves mobility issues in tight spaces.
A harder time managing the intense physiological heat generated by the stress response.
And a generally harder time recovering from the physical injuries sustained during the event. Our everyday physical conditions become exponentially more critical when the survival arc begins.
So we have our individual brains, our individual genetic markers, and our physical bodies all trying to process this threat during the deliberation phase.
But here's the thing. Disasters almost never happen to us when we are perfectly isolated in a vacuum.
They happen in office buildings, on packed airplanes, in crowded city squares. We're surrounded by other people.
Which means we have to talk about how the group influences the individual. We do not survive alone.
It's a crucial transition. It's fascinating how the brain betrays us on an individual level, but the moment other people are involved, that individual biological response gets hijacked by the crowd.
How we deliberate is massively influenced by the people standing right next to us.
Disaster victims are members of a group, whether they want to be or not. And humans behave very differently in a collective than they do on their own.
The people we live and work with dictate our survival just as much as our own internal instincts do.
Ripley uses a stunning comparison of two different communities during the devastating 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami to illustrate this power.
This contrast is one of the most powerful parts of the research. You have two different communities facing the exact same geological threat.
The first is a place called Longi, located on Similu Island off the coast of Sumatra.
In Longi, the community has a deeply ingrained oral tradition centered around a specific word, smong.
It translates roughly to tsunami, but it carries a whole cultural weight.
Back in 1907, a massive earthquake and tsunami hit that island and wiped out a huge portion of their population.
The survivors of that 1907 event passed down a very strict, non-negotiable rule through the generations.
When the ground shakes, you don't wait. You don't go look at the ocean to see what's happening. You immediately drop what you were doing and run to high ground.
They had a preloaded script for deliberation.
Exactly. So fast forward almost a century to 2004, the massive earthquake hits.
And the people of Longi do exactly what their grandfathers told them to do. Out of 78,000 people living on that island, only 7 died in the tsunami.
And the tragic part is, those 7 died mostly because they stopped to gather their belongings.
Which goes right back to that denial phase gathering instinct we talked about with the woman looking for her purse on 9/11.
But overall, the survival rate was miraculous.
Now compare that to a coastal community called Jantang.
When researchers visited Jantang after the 2004 tsunami, they found a completely different, horrifying reality.
The people there had no oral tradition regarding tsunamis. No one had ever heard a word like smong.
When the earthquake struck, and the residents heard what sounded like massive booming explosions coming from the ocean as the wave approached, they couldn't interpret the sound correctly.
Their brains searched for a script.
And in that specific region, the most common cultural script for loud, terrifying noises was gunfights between local rebels and the military.
So they applied the wrong script to the disaster.
Yes. They did exactly what you were supposed to do in a gunfight. They ran inside, shut their doors, and locked themselves in their houses.
They sealed themselves inside their own tombs because the group lacked the cultural knowledge to interpret the geological threat.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it illustrates a vital point about how we survive in the modern world.
Social ties, community knowledge, and cultural traditions often save vastly more lives than the most advanced modern technology.
We rely so heavily on automated sirens and text alerts on our phones now.
But Ripley brings up the 1960 earthquake in Chile, which triggered a massive tsunami aimed directly at Hawaii.
Hawaii had an automated, state-of-the-art alert system. The sirens went off a full 10 hours before the wave hit Hilo.
The technology worked flawlessly, but 61 people died anyway.
Why did they die when they had 10 hours of warning? Because the people heard the sirens and simply ignored them.
Or worse, they misinterpreted them. They didn't know what the noise explicitly meant.
Some thought it was a drill. Some thought it just meant they should turn on the radio and wait for more information.
The technology was present, but the cultural tradition, the shared understanding of what action to take when the siren wails, was completely absent.
We've outsourced our survival instincts to infrastructure.
We have become incredibly interdependent on a sprawling network of public and private entities, governments, weather services, tech companies for our survival.
Yet on a community level, we are increasingly socially isolated. We substitute technology for the community ties and pass down wisdom that protected our ancestors.
Animals still possess this pure instinct. Hours before the 2004 tsunami, witnesses reported that elephants broke their heavy logging chains and immediately headed for high ground.
But humans have lost that pure, unmediated instinct. We rely on the group, and if the group lacks a survival tradition, the deliberation phase stretches on indefinitely until it's simply too late to escape.
But eventually that deliberation has to end. The milling stops. The time for denial is completely over.
The smoke's too thick or the water is rushing in.
This is when we cross the threshold into the final phase of the survival arc, the decisive moment.
This is where the uncertainty finally disappears, and purposeful action either begins or it critically fails to begin.
And as we talk about this decisive action, we have to address the elephant in the room. What about panic? You mentioned earlier that Hollywood gets it wrong and that mass panic isn't the default, but surely panic does happen sometimes.
It does happen, but it is incredibly rare, and from an evolutionary standpoint, highly maladaptive.
If our ancient ancestors panicked and ran screaming in every direction every time they saw a predator, we wouldn't have survived as a species.
The prevailing belief that crowds inevitably panic is actually a dangerous myth because it causes authorities to withhold vital information from the public.
Officials often delay sounding alarms or issuing evacuation orders because they are terrified of sparking a deadly stampede.
A sociologist named Enrico L. Quarantelli spent his career studying this, and he mapped out the exact conditions required for true panic to occur.
He created a sort of recipe for panic, and the absolute primary ingredient is that people must feel they may be trapped.
May be trapped. That's a very specific distinction. Not definitely trapped.
The distinction is everything. If people know they are definitely trapped, with absolutely zero way out, imagine the crew of a doomed submarine that has lost power and is sinking to crushed depth. They rarely panic.
They might experience profound despair, but they generally accept their fate calmly.
Panic requires a closing window of escape. It requires the belief that survival is possible, but it is rapidly slipping away and you have to fight to get through that closing window.
Quarantelli used the harrowing example of refugees in an open field being strafed by military planes.
They aren't confined in a burning room, but they feel potentially trapped by the incoming fire and the lack of cover, which triggers panic.
And the fear that people will just panic for no reason is so pervasive among authorities.
Ripley shares a revealing experiment involving library fire drills. A researcher named Ed Galea wanted to study evacuation times, so he ran an unannounced fire drill at a university library in Great Britain.
The alarms went off, and the British students evacuated in a very orderly, highly rational, almost polite fashion. They packed up their bags and walked out.
Then, Galea travels to Brazil to run the exact same experiment at a university there. But the Brazilian authorities pushed back hard against the idea.
They were completely convinced that an unannounced drill would cause mass hysteria.
Right. They legitimately feared that if the alarms went off without warning, the Brazilian students would panic so hard they would bite their own tongues off.
They envisioned a literal stampede of tongueless innocents fleeing the library in absolute terror.
It highlights the sheer superstition and cultural bias we hold regarding crowd behavior. We assume crowds are inherently volatile and irrational.
When Galea finally convinced them to let him run the drill, the Brazilian students evacuated just as rationally and orderly as the British students.
Nobody panicked, nobody got trampled, and nobody bit their tongue off.
Panic is the rare exception, not the rule, which forces us to confront a much more disturbing question. If panic isn't the default reaction in the decisive moment, what is?
And the answer is deeply unsettling. The most common reaction when action is required is paralysis.
Paralysis, negative panic, the body just shutting down completely.
Yes. People go limp, they become perfectly still, they lose all awareness of their surroundings and essentially do nothing.
And while it seems like a total failure of the survival drive, it is actually an involuntary, deeply evolved physiological response.
Ripley uses a harrowing story to illustrate this, and it takes us to the tragic Virginia Tech shooting.
There was a student named Colin Violend sitting in a French class when the shooter entered the building.
Now, if we think about what we assume we would do in an active shooter situation, we like to think we'd run or fight back, or at the very least, dive under a heavy desk and curl up into a protective ball.
But that's not what Violend did. When he heard the shots down the hall and saw the gunman enter the room, his mind went into a distinct, altered mode.
He crumpled to the floor under his desk, but he lay out in the open, slightly twisted, in a highly vulnerable, awkward position. And he played dead. He lay perfectly, unnaturally still.
And this wasn't a conscious, tactical decision he made in the moment. In retrospect, survivors often try to create a narrative of strategy to explain their actions. But at the time, Violend's brain subconsciously recognized an ancient pattern. The predator targets movement.
The shooter was methodically walking around the room, shooting anyone who moved or made a sound.
Violend's profound stillness was an involuntary biological response to a lethal predator. Experts who study animal and human paralysis call it a textbook case of tonic immobility.
It is a survival strategy for the body when neither fight nor flight is a viable option.
The opossum playing dead.
Exactly. But the massive problem with paralysis in modern disasters like a burning skyscraper, a sinking ferry, or an airplane crash is that playing dead will get you killed.
If you sit limply in your airplane seat while the cabin fills with toxic smoke, you will asphyxiate and die.
The predator isn't looking for movement. The predator is the smoke. So how do we break this stupor?
It requires external shock.
It requires strong, aggressive leadership. The locked-in state of the amygdala has to be shattered by an outside force.
This is precisely why modern flight attendants are specifically trained not just to ask people to leave the plane, but to literally shriek at passengers,
They are trained to yell aggressively, to project anger and urgency.
to shock the passengers' brains out of that paralysis and jolt the hippocampus back online so they can physically stand up and move.
It's amazing how we have to reverse engineer our own biology to survive the environments we've built.
So we have panic, which is a rare scramble for a closing window.
Yeah.
We have paralysis, which is the common, terrifying default.
But then there is the outlier in the decisive moment, the most complex and misunderstood action of all, heroism.
Heroism is incredibly nebulous to study. From a strict evolutionary perspective, risking your own life to save a complete stranger contradicts the most basic biological drive for self-preservation.
You are risking your own genetic continuity for someone outside your kin.
But we see it happen time and time again. Ripley recounts the aftermath of the horrific plane crash in the freezing Potomac River in Washington, D.C.
Bystanders on the shore, regular commuters who had just stopped their cars to watch, didn't run away.
They started taking off their coats, tying scarves and jumper cables together to create makeshift lifelines.
And some ordinary people actually jumped into the freezing ice-choked water to pull strangers from the sinking wreckage.
It's the highest expression of our humanity. But Ripley also issues a stark warning about heroism, doesn't she?
It isn't always the perfect cinematic intervention we want it to be. She tells a story about an Israeli man who always fantasized about being a hero.
He carried a knapsack full of first aid supplies everywhere he went, desperately wanting to be the one to save the day if something happened.
One day, his dark fantasy comes true. A bomb goes off on a bus right near him.
He rushes over into the smoke and chaos, and he immediately starts pulling victims out of the wreckage.
But when the professional paramedics finally arrive, they have to stop him. They point out that one of the victims he rapidly moved had severe spinal injuries from the blast.
By dragging the victim to safety, the well-meaning hero had caused terrible, irreversible damage.
That story is vital because it strips the romanticism away from disaster behavior.
The trauma psychologist, who later treated that Israeli man, observed that heroism, in some cases, is actually a survival strategy for the mind of the rescuer.
When you are facing the overwhelming chaos, the noise, and the profound helplessness of a catastrophe, stepping into the active role of a savior is a way for your brain to exert control over an uncontrollable situation.
It's a psychological defense mechanism, an attempt to play God in a moment of utter powerlessness.
But without proper training and situational awareness, that impulse can be just as dangerous to the victims as the hesitation we talked about earlier.
Heroism is real, but it is a complex product of experience, aspiration, and fear.
So bringing this all together, we've traced the survival arc through denial, deliberation, and the decisive moment.
We've seen how our brains try to blind us to reality, how our bodies pump us full of stress hormones that lock us in, and how we either freeze, panic, or manage to act.
So what does this all mean? How can you, the listener, use this knowledge? How can we actively close that perception gap so that we don't just become statistics?
Ripley introduces a brilliant analogy from a high-performance driving school to explain how we can retrain our instincts.
The driving instructor takes students out onto a wet skid pad, a massive, incredibly slippery piece of asphalt.
He gets the car up to speed, and then he suddenly pulls the emergency brake while violently yanking the steering wheel, throwing the car into an uncontrollable, terrifying spin.
The natural human reflex in this moment of sheer terror is to stare directly at the threat, say a pothole, a concrete barrier, or an oncoming car, and slam on the brakes as hard as possible.
Which is exactly the wrong thing to do in a skid. It locks the wheels and guarantees a crash.
Precisely. The instructor calls this fatal reflex potholism.
The human brain has a deeply wired tendency to direct the hands toward whatever the eyes are locked onto.
The more you stare at the pothole in terror, the more likely your hands are to steer the wheel directly into it.
If you stare at the threat, you collide with the threat. To survive the skid, you must consciously, aggressively train your brain to look away from the danger.
You have to force your eyes to look toward the empty space, the escape route. You have to override the panic, squeeze the brakes gently, and steer towards safety.
And that physical act of redirecting your focus is the perfect metaphor for everything Ripley is trying to teach us about disaster survival. We have to create new instincts.
The research shows unequivocally that preparation and rehearsal drastically influence how quickly we move through the survival arc.
Training doesn't eliminate fear. You can't just turn off the amygdala.
But preparation creates neurological shortcuts in the brain that completely bypass the debilitating delays of the denial and deliberation phases.
We saw the ultimate proof of this with a man named Rick Rescorla. He was the director of security for Morgan Stanley, whose offices occupied several floors of the South Tower of the World Trade Center.
Rescorla understood human hesitation. He knew people would freeze.
So he constantly, almost obsessively, drilled his employees on evacuation routes. He made them walk the stairs.
They hated it, they complained, but he forced them to do it.
When 9/11 happened, his people didn't spend 45 minutes shutting down their computers and milling around asking each other what to do. They moved.
He had preloaded the escape script into their brains. Because of his preparation, nearly all of Morgan Stanley's 2,700 employees survived.
But you don't need to be a militant security expert to do this in your own life. Everyday people can program these shortcuts.
Right. Ripley mentions that FAA human factor analysts, the experts who study plane crashes and passenger behavior for a living, always do one specific thing when they board a commercial flight.
They count the exact number of rows from their seat to the nearest exit.
They know that if the cabin fills with toxic, blinding smoke, their brain might become cognitively impaired by fear.
They know they won't be able to process complex spatial information. But if they have the simple number 7 hardwired into their memory, 7 rows to the exit, they can literally feel their way out in the pitch black.
Disaster researchers do this too. When they check into a hotel, they immediately drop their bags, walk out into the hallway, and take the stairs down from their room to the lobby.
They do it just to physically learn the confusing layouts of the back stairwells.
To a layman, these sound like paranoid behaviors, but they are actually incredibly empowering.
By taking these tiny, deliberate actions, you are negotiating with your own fear before the fear even exists.
You are accepting the reality that disaster is possible, and you are giving your brain the exact data points it will frantically search for when the normalcy bias eventually shatters.
You are ensuring that when the time for deliberation comes, you don't have to ask 4 strangers what to do. You already have the answer.
You are closing the gap between the onset of danger and the decisive moment of action. We spend so much of our lives assuming that safety is a service provided by someone else. We expect the systems to catch us when we fall.
But Ripley's work proves that survival is deeply personal, and it starts entirely with perception.
Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over.
We spend so much time and money insuring our homes, our cars, and our health against disaster. We buy policies to protect our physical assets, yet we spend almost zero time insuring our own minds. If your brain is the true first responder, what is the premium you are willing to pay today in small moments of preparation to ensure it doesn't default to denial when the unthinkable happens?
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked to the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore.